Governments know exactly what they're doing. The various machines, propaganda machines that are at work and very well resourced and very skillful in their use of technology. They know exactly what they're doing. It's war by another means with the journalist as the target. So keep the pressure on. Question everything you do. Even if they're lying about you, it can take 2 or 3 days, at the very least, to clear up the lie. And by then, the news agenda has moved on. And the idea is to make people afraid to go to certain subjects. And the Gaza conflict is a classic example of that, where journalists are targeted and told, and I mean, we're lucky we're not getting physically targeted, okay? We're not the guys who are so bravely doing the work, and we've heard testimony in the last few days about that in Gaza. But going after you online to make sure that you feel the fear, okay? To make you think, oh God, do I really want to be doing this story? Maybe I should go and do Ukraine because I'm not going to get the same level of abuse. I should point out that in the beginning of the Ukraine story, before everybody I'm talking about 2014 onwards, there was lots of abuse from kind of pro-Russian bot farms. I was on the end of quite a bit of it. But now that, the gaze has shifted, the kind of scale of abuse that you will get covering Gaza, for example, it's of a much greater magnitude and very destabilizing for people.
You came out, if that's the word, as a journalist contending with trauma and PTSD. You've been very open, both in your writing and in a doc that you made about this. First of all, what made you decide to put yourself out there in this? And what kind of reception did you receive from your colleagues when you've done that?
I'll deal with the latter half of the question first, if you don't mind. I had an amazing response from my colleagues. The number of people, and not just on the BBC, but across the whole business, who got in touch with me, and particularly younger career journalists who are still getting in touch with me, saying, it's allowed me, themselves, to articulate to my bosses what's going on with me. And people sharing with me the kind of struggles they had, particularly with addiction. It's one of the key determinants that in newsrooms gets people into trouble with HR. People deal with, we're nowhere near as tolerant of heavy drinking and drug taking as people used to be in the 90s, when I was at my peak of substance abuse, dealing with PTSD. But people are still struggling with these issues, and it's likely to get them very often into a disciplinary process. And it's only when it reaches that managers begin to ask, well, maybe there's something else going on underneath that. And very often you'll find it has to do with trauma, it has to do with burnout, with moral injury, however we want to describe that. And one of the things that I would plead for is, when managers, whether it's news editors or people at Alessandra's level, see people who are battling with addiction, don't write them off as bad people. Don't make the assumption that they're somehow morally lax or degenerate and that that's the issue, because it's very rarely, if ever, the issue. Dig deep and see what's underneath it. It is worth the time and the investment and the basic humanity in dealing with people who you are sending into places of danger.
Often what we have seen is that our colleagues who have gone through traumatic situations or who have faced issues like substance abuse or sort of very difficult moments in their lives, that the meaningful work, many of them are very committed to the mission of journalism, that mission that they did maybe to such an extent that it then, caused problems in their lives, and that actually allowing them somehow to continue to do this meaningful work was really, really important for them. So sort of trying to balance that need to protect them physically, especially when we're talking about going into conflict zones, which obviously if you are, if you're, in a moment which is difficult for you, then we might be worried about you're going obviously into a situation which might not be safe. But balancing that actually with that need to do meaningful work is something that we have seen is really important. And obviously others can speak, more eloquently on this. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think for large organizations, we have the funds and we also have the ability globally to, help our journalists in traumatic situations. But I think it is incumbent upon us, and we try to do so, to share information with smaller news organizations. Jody mentioned Rory Peck, which deals with journalists who are out on the field without necessarily a large organization behind them. So sort of freelancers and contractors. And it is very important for us to support for the large organizations, the one who do have the funds to support them. And we try to, as much as we can. The only last thing I was going to say is that we're in a moment in which in certain parts of the world, and certainly in the US where many of us operate, where, we have to be careful talking, as crazy it may seem, but issues like race and gender and, differences. But those things matter when we're talking about journalist safety, so that we have to be careful and we have to be mindful and be very aware of people's, how people look, or what their, what their gender is, or what their sexuality is, or what their religion is, and what their race is. And I think we're in this moment where we're being told that we have to be so careful that actually that could hurt journalist safety. So again, it's just a balance that we have to constantly be aware of.
And certainly in the trauma research, we know that identity is never neutral, that who we are is what we bring to the party. Right. Fergal, you had something you were going to pick up on there.
Yeah, I think what we're looking at is a series of responsibilities. Now, I have seen managements time and again, and this is across the industry, newspapers, the big wire services, broadcasters, sending journalists into conflict zones who happen to be really brilliant conflict reporters, but who have suffered and continue to suffer. But management make a conscious decision, well, I know they're suffering, and I know they're never going to say, I'll not do it. They want to go. And there's a kind of, Faustian pact. You go in, you'll win a big prize, people will pat you on the back and tell you how wonderful you are. And, this, I know it myself. Now, I suddenly came across a boss, my foreign editor in the BBC, who said, no, you're not going. I remember the moment I was in Kyiv, and the refugees were coming to Kyiv, and I was, at the beginning of the war, and I was given an offer to go east to the front line on a train, and I rang him, and he said, the immortal words, do you really think that's a good idea for someone who suffers from PTSD? So he didn't quite say no, but he effectively said no. And that was a really brave and important decision. I really didn't like it at the time. I felt my self-esteem had taken a huge hit. I felt this whole image I had of myself as this kind of fearless war correspondent was gone. Somehow I was I felt like one of those guys that you see in movies about the First World War in a psychiatric hospital, wandering around gibbering. And that had been me a year earlier. I had been the guy in the psychiatric hospital. But it was a brave decision by a manager. Now, how many other managers would do that when confronted with people who are very, very good at what they do, very, very brave, but suffering from addiction and post-traumatic stress as a consequence of what they do?
I'm going to get to Jody in a minute, but in fairness, Fergal, I should also say that it's not like that kept you home in the garage. My memory is that you did some wonderful reporting on the refugee flow, in which your deep knowledge of trauma was very clear in whose stories you were telling and how you were telling them, right?
That's true, but I think the point I'm trying to get across about responsibility is, and about if you're a journalist who's struggling with mental health problems, and I can only speak for myself, I was in the psychiatric hospital, and it was about 3 a.m. I was watching a Netflix doc, as you do, wide awake. And there was a psychiatrist dealing with a celebrity client, and he made this point. He said, look, there's 3 things you got to remember about mental health. He said, number 1, life is full of pain. Number 2, life is full of uncertainty. And number 3, and this was the one that hit home to me, if you want to preserve your mental health, you're going to have to work hard every day of your life. And if you're someone like me, who's done the things I've done, been to the places I've been, then I have to work all the time. I cannot take a moment off. I can't delude myself into thinking, well, maybe one trip to Beirut would be okay. Yeah. Maybe if I try to sneak into Iran with the Kurds, it would be okay. All the kind of stuff I used to do. And back when I was addicted to people telling me what a great guy I was and how brave I was, all of that bullshit that led me to a psychiatric hospital on, several occasions. So it's that. I would, to younger journalists, never ever, and it sounds rich for me having had the great time over the last 40 years, but never ever compromise. I suppose when it comes down to your personal possibility of happiness and peace of mind for a job.
Fergal, can I just say that what you're saying is amazing, and I have had to say no. Ultimately, all safety decisions come up to me, and the final decision comes up to me as to whether to send people into conflict. And I have very, very grumpy and unhappy journalists in my newsroom to whom I have said no. So to hear your words, I wish I could sort of record them and show them in my newsroom and it is a very difficult decision to say no, because of course a lot of our colleagues are so brilliant. They have been doing this for so many years. And also they think that I'm not a conflict journalist. And so they think, they might think, they don't say this out loud, but they might think, well, what does she know, right? But when you notice that somebody is not just 100% or even 50%, I mean, if you notice that someone is even a small percentage, facing trauma or recovering from PTSD or hurt or troubled, then no story is worth a life, and that is that is a principle that we live by all the time, despite the fact that we cover so many conflicts every day. So it's wonderful to hear you say that.
Look, we sit here as 4 white Western journalists, and it's easy to talk about. It feels easy to talk about some of this stuff, right? Because some of us can make those decisions to not take the story and not do the thing. But for many people, they can't take away their race, they can't take away their gender, they can't take away their sexuality, they can't leave their countries, right? And so I think all of these things are helpful, but I think we really have to be mindful that for many journalists, I would say the vast majority of journalists that we work with are suffering because the reason that they are being traumatized isn't to do with the fact that they're being sent to cover a war. It's because they are stuck in these situations that they cannot avoid. They cannot, because of their identity, because they cannot move, because of their communities, because of who they are. And I think we really have to recognize that, because us stepping up isn't simply about saying, and this isn't me having a go at Alessandra and Fergal, but we can't just say, oh, well, don't do that story, because some people do not have a choice. They need that job. They need to cover that issue. They can't move out of their communities. And so working out how we support people where they are, with who they are, is absolutely critical in this moment.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, yeah. I think the key thing, and I was careful to use it because I've learned over the years how important it is when you address issues of mental health. When I address issues of mental health, I speak only from my own experience. I speak of the journey that I know and have made and continue to make, and that will be different. But the struggles, I know it from meeting with my colleagues in Palestine, in other parts of the Middle East, particularly in Africa, in Ukraine, through our conversations, that they experience the same pressures, but without the kind of backup that I had. Now, when I went to the BBC, and it was very obvious I was falling apart, there was someone there to hold my hand and make sure I got the treatment I needed to get me into hospital. You know, most of the colleagues of mine that I work with in the world's conflict zones don't have that privilege. And the question for us is how we extend, you know, the kind of pain and trauma that you feel once you've been psychologically damaged, it doesn't matter where you are, okay? Mine is no less than it is someone in the Central African Republic, but theirs is no less than mine. The mind is, when the mind starts to suffer and fall apart, that kind of pain is universal. You know, it doesn't belong to a race or a creed or an identity. But what does belong to race, creed, or identity is the level of privilege that will ensure whether you get treated or not. And that's the thing we've got to change.
It also goes to the availability of mental health resources, and we've been talking a lot about sort of therapy, and certainly making professional mental health resources available to journalists anywhere in the world who needs it is an important priority that we're only just beginning to think through how to train clinicians. But the other side of it is that for a lot of mental health challenges and issues, and for trauma and a lot of things, there's scarce mental health resources, period. And it turns out in the research that support from colleagues, peer support, and a culture of support is also really crucial, and in fact may be more important to more journalists. Jody, what?
Yeah, so I'll come to that. I think that's right. I think, you know, there are some obvious things that we could do that are preventative, though, right? So I think Fergal mentioned it, that kind of insecurity is one of them, right? So if you are a freelancer and you're not being given by your employer training to deal with a traumatic situation, you're not being given personal protective equipment to go and cover a dangerous situation, you've not got any insurance, that precarity, that insecurity is a precursor to having traumatic experience afterwards, right? So there's a bunch of stuff that we could and should be doing better to give support to those people, firstly. You're absolutely right. Subsequently, having a peer support network is very important. So we've been doing some work recently where rather than providing funding for, say, one-on-one mental health support, which is, I think, how we traditionally think of it, you know, sort of you sitting in a room, actually we've been funding a number of workshop sounds fuzzy. I don't like the word workshop, but funding things where groups come together who've experienced similar issues. For example, Burmese journalists on the Thai-Myanmar border, where we've been able to bring people together who've experienced similar things and give them different kinds of support, you know, where they get to talk to one another. We've done a similar thing with Russian journalists in exile. And that, I think, that having that peer support network and having other people to talk with and about does help. But I really want to stress how some of this stuff, I think, can be avoided much earlier if we provide some of the kind of stability that people need so they're not put in those situations.
Everything we've been talking about, of course, affects journalists who are reporting in their own countries more than foreign correspondents, right? So this is true for journalists in Gaza. You know, we, along with the BBC, with AP and AFP, had staff journalists who were in Gaza and who, while they were reporting for the world, they were trying to keep their families safe. They were trying to feed their children. In one of our colleagues' cases, he gave birth to one of his children under the bombs. And so just imagine having to reporting while you're trying to find food, you know, is it horrific? And this was true in Ukraine when you're trying to get your kids to school, you know, even as you haven't slept all night because you've been constantly hearing bombs and have had to go to shelters. And Russia as well, when you're working for a foreign organization and who is listening to you, and countless examples. And so I think to Jody's point about, you know, workshops or not workshops or, you know, training, making sure that when, in the cases in which one evacuate, or some of our local journalists can no longer go back to their countries because we've been successful in getting them out, is making sure that we are training them, like all of our journalists, to be able to cover other areas of the world or work in other parts of the newsroom. And this is very, very important. So I think Jodi's point is really, really well made. To the point of moral injury, it's a growing issue in newsroom, in particular because early career journalists, rightfully, understandingly, are more advocates, I would say. You know, they believe strongly that if they're journalists because they're there to help make the world a better place, well then, God damn it, there's right and there's wrong. Our approach is, this is fine, but let's first create a foundation of facts and truth and understanding about what is actually happening in the places in which we're reporting. And then upon that, we can, you can go out into the world and do what you will, outside of the workspace and be an advocate or fight for this or for the other. But we firmly believe that when you leave your house and you get into our newsroom, your primary goal is to find the facts. And those facts will help governments, will help other authorities, will help companies, will help societies then do what they think is the right thing. But that basis, that sort of crucible of truth, has to be the foundation of what we do. But it's not easy. It's not an easy balance, of course, because we all want to do the right thing. And we believe in freedom of speech, obviously. And we believe that wrongs need to be righted.
So I was prosecuted by Jacob Zuma. You helped, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists helped a great deal. I got a lot of death threats and rape threats. And Fergal, I just wanted to express my extreme appreciation to you, because I remember being in such a broken emotional state and so anxiety-ridden and afraid and almost sick, because I'm a type 1 diabetic. I was going into comas all the time. And hearing you say what you said, it helped me, and I got the help. And I'm sorry, I'm so emotional. But when you do that, you give people permission to look after themselves, because I respect you so much. And I just wanted to say thank you, because I know you saved my life, and I know you saved so many others in so many ways. So I just wanted to say thank you.